Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness lead us to the biggest truths. Every parent knows that children see the world differently than we do. They follow their hearts when we follow our fears. 8-year-old Atsá lives in an Apache village in 1880s Arizona. When she finds a bleeding dog, she decides to follow it into the desert. Her family tells her not to go, but something pulls her forward. The dog leads her to an old cabin that everyone thought was empty. Inside, she finds a dying white man who knows her mother's name. There's also an old sword and a journal filled with secrets. These discoveries will change everything her family believed about their past. The truth has been hiding for decades, waiting for one brave little girl to uncover it. What really happened between her people and the white settlers all those years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn painted the Arizona desert in shades of amber and rose, casting long shadows across the Apache village nestled in a protected valley. Smoke from morning fires curled upward like prayers, carrying the scent of burning mesquite and the promise of another day's survival in this harsh but beautiful land. Atsá stirred in her family's wickiup, the traditional dome-shaped dwelling made of willow branches and covered with brush and hide. At 8 years old, she possessed an unusual stillness for a child, a quality her grandmother had noticed and quietly encouraged. Where other children her age would chatter and fidget, Atsá often sat in thoughtful silence, watching the world with eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface of things. Her mother, Desba, knelt by the fire pit, grinding corn on a metate, the rhythmic scraping sound, a familiar comfort in their morning routine. Desba was a woman of 32 years who carried herself with the dignity befitting her status as the daughter of Ashki, one of the village's most respected elders. Her hands, strong and calloused from years of hard work, moved with practiced efficiency as she prepared the morning meal. "The sun greets us with warmth today," Desba said softly, not looking up from her work. It was her way of acknowledging that Atsá was awake without demanding immediate conversation. A respect for her daughter's contemplative nature that had developed over years of understanding. Atsá pushed aside the woven blanket and rose, her small feet finding the earth floor of their home. She moved to the water ola and splashed cool water on her face, the shock of it bringing full awareness to her senses. Through the doorway, she could see her grandfather Ashki speaking with other men near the central fire, their voices low and serious as they discussed matters that seemed to weigh heavily on all the adults lately. "What troubles grandfather this morning?" Atsá asked, her voice still soft with sleep. Desba's hands paused for just a moment in their grinding motion. "The same troubles that have visited us for many seasons, little one." The blue coats grow bolder in their movements through our lands. Yesterday Nalnish and the other scouts reported seeing survey markers 2 days' ride to the south. Nalnish was Atsá's older brother, 17 years old, and already proving himself as one of the village's most capable young warriors. The mention of survey markers made Atsá's stomach tighten with a familiar anxiety. She had heard enough adult conversations to understand that such markers usually meant white settlers weren't far behind, bringing with them the kind of conflicts that had already driven their people from richer lands to the north and east. "Are we in danger?" she asked, settling beside her mother to help with the morning preparations. Desba's expression softened as she looked at her daughter. "We are always careful, Atsá. That is how our people survive. But fear should not govern our days. We trust in the wisdom of our elders and the protection of our warriors." From outside their dwelling came the sound of voices raised in concern, but not alarm. Atsá recognized the tone. Something unusual had happened, but not something that threatened immediate danger. Her curiosity piqued. She moved toward the entrance. "Stay close today," Desba called after her, a note of unusual firmness in her voice that made Atsá pause and look back questioningly. Before she could ask why, a commotion from the village center drew their attention. Nalnish's voice carried over the others, speaking quickly in their language, his words punctuated by exclamations of surprise from the gathered adults. Atsá stepped outside and immediately saw the source of the disturbance. Near the central fire, a dog lay on its side, its breathing labored and shallow. But this was no village dog. It was larger than the lean, desert-adapted animals that lived among their people. This was a border collie, its black and white coat matted with dried blood and desert grit, its tongue lolling as it panted in the morning heat. "Where did it come from?" asked Yiska, one of the village women, keeping a respectful distance from the animal. Nalnish knelt beside the dog, his warriors, training evident in how he assessed the situation without touching the injured animal unnecessarily. "I found it at the eastern edge of camp when I returned from my watch. It was trying to drag itself toward the center of the village." Ashki approached the scene, his weathered face grave with concern. At 68 years old, he moved with the careful dignity of a man who had seen many seasons and learned to read signs that others might miss. His long grey hair was braided with leather and small bones, marking his status as both elder and medicine man. "This is not a wild dog," he observed, studying the animal's build and the remnants of what had once been a leather collar around its neck. "It belongs to the white men." The gathered villagers murmured among themselves, some stepping back instinctively. Dogs from the white settlements often meant their owners weren't far behind, and surprise visits from settlers rarely brought good news. But Atsá felt something different as she looked at the injured animal. While the adults saw potential danger, she saw suffering that called to something deep within her spirit. The dog's dark eyes, clouded with pain, seemed to be searching the faces around it, looking for something or someone specific. "It's dying," she said softly, moving closer despite her mother's sharp intake of breath behind her. "Atsá, come away from there," Desba commanded, her voice carrying an edge that her daughter rarely heard. But the child ignored the command, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name. She approached the dog slowly, her small hands extended so the animal could catch her scent. To everyone's surprise, the dog's tail gave a weak wag, and it lifted its head slightly to look at her more directly. "It knows something," Atsá whispered, reaching out to gently touch the dog's head. The animal whimpered softly, but didn't pull away. "It's trying to tell us something." Ashki's eyes narrowed as he studied his granddaughter's interaction with the dog. As a man who had spent decades learning to read the signs that the spirits sent through animals and natural phenomena, he recognized something significant in what he was witnessing. "The dog is a messenger," he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of spiritual authority that made the other adults listen carefully. But what message it carries, and from whom, remains to be seen. Yiska shifted uncomfortably. "Should we not drive it away? If it belongs to the white men, it belongs to no one now," Ashki interrupted gently. "Look at its condition. It has traveled far and suffered much to reach us. We do not turn away messengers, regardless of their origin." Desba approached her daughter, her face tight with worry. "Atsá, step back now. Let the men decide what to do." But Atsá remained kneeling beside the dog, her hand resting on its head. She could feel the animal's labored breathing, the way its body trembled with exhaustion and pain. More than that, she could sense its urgency, a desperate need to communicate something that went beyond its own suffering. "It wants me to follow it," she said suddenly, the words surprising her as much as they surprised the adults around her. The statement was met with immediate protests from several directions, but Ashki held up his hand for silence. He moved closer to his granddaughter, studying both her face and the dog's reaction to her presence. "What makes you say this, child?" Atsá struggled to put her intuition into words. "I can feel it. The dog didn't come here to die. It came here to find someone, to lead someone somewhere." She looked up at her grandfather with earnest eyes. "I think it came for me," Nalnish scoffed gently. "Sister, you cannot know the mind of a wounded animal. It is confused and in pain." But Ashki was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands tracing the sacred patterns tattooed on his forearms as he considered his granddaughter's words. He had taught Atsá from an early age to trust her spiritual instincts, to listen to the voices that spoke through wind and stone and the behavior of animals. He could not now dismiss what she claimed to sense simply because it was inconvenient or potentially dangerous. "Where would it lead you?" he asked finally. Atsá closed her eyes and tried to quiet her mind the way her grandfather had taught her. When she opened them again, she was looking toward the eastern desert, toward the vast expanse of land that stretched beyond their protected valley. "Into the desert, toward the old cabin." The words fell into the gathered group like stones into still water, creating ripples of unease and recognition. The old cabin was a place of legend and whispered stories, a structure that had stood abandoned in the desert for as long as anyone could remember. Some said it had once belonged to a hermit prospector who had disappeared decades ago. Others claimed it was cursed, a place where spirits gathered to remember old sorrows. Desba's face went pale, a reaction so sudden and pronounced that several people noticed it. She reached for her daughter's arm with a grip that was almost desperate. "No," she said firmly, "you will not follow this animal anywhere, and certainly not to that place." Her reaction was stronger than the situation seemed to warrant, and Ashki studied his daughter's face with growing concern. In all her years, Desba had never shown fear of the old cabin or any other place in their territory. Her sudden terror suggested knowledge she had never shared. "What do you know about the cabin, daughter?" he asked quietly. Desba's eyes darted. Between her father and her daughter, her internal struggle visible to all who watched. Finally she seemed to gather herself, straightening her shoulders with visible effort. "I know enough to keep my daughter away from it," she said firmly. "Some places are better left undisturbed." But even as she spoke, the injured dog struggled to lift its head, its eyes fixed on Atsá with unmistakable intelligence and purpose. The animal was clearly fighting to stay conscious, to communicate something vital before its strength failed completely. Atsá felt the pull more strongly now, a certainty that settled in her chest like a warm stone. This dog had traveled far and endured much to reach their village, to reach her specifically. Whatever waited at the old cabin, she was meant to discover it. "I have to go," she said quietly, her young voice carrying a conviction that surprised even herself. "This dog needs my help, and something is waiting that only I can find." The words hung in the desert air like a prophecy, touching something ancient and knowing in the hearts of all who heard them. And in that moment, everyone present understood that the child's declaration was not a request for permission, but a statement of destiny that had already been written in the stars above their heads. The argument that followed lasted well into the morning, voices rising and falling like desert winds as the adults debated what to do about both the dog and Atsá's declared intention to follow it. But the child had inherited more than spiritual sensitivity from her bloodline. She had also inherited the quiet stubbornness that ran through her grandfather's family like a deep vein of iron ore. While the adults talked, Atsá sat beside the wounded animal, her small hands gentle as she offered it water from a gourd and spoke to it in soft, reassuring tones. The dog's breathing had steadied somewhat, but she could see the urgency in its eyes hadn't diminished. If anything, it seemed to grow more desperate as the morning wore on, as if time were running out for something important. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith and the heat began to shimmer off the desert floor in visible waves, Atsá made her decision. While her mother was helping other women with the midday meal preparation, and the men had moved to the shade to continue their discussions, she gathered a small bundle of supplies, water, dried meat, and the small knife her grandfather had given her for her 8th birthday. The dog, sensing her movement, struggled to its feet with a whimper of pain but clear determination. Despite its injuries, the animal was ready to fulfill its purpose. "You're sure about this, aren't you?" Atsá whispered, studying the dog's intelligent eyes. The answer she saw there was unmistakable. She began walking toward the eastern edge of the village, and the dog fell into step beside her, limping but moving with surprising strength for an animal that had seemed near death just hours before. They had nearly reached the desert's edge when Nalnish's voice called out behind them, "Atsá, where are you going?" She turned to face her brother, her chin lifted with determination that reminded him powerfully of their grandfather in his younger days. "I'm following the path I'm meant to follow," she said simply. Nalnish approached quickly, his warrior's instincts alert to the danger his little sister was contemplating. "You cannot go into the desert alone. Mother will be furious, and Grandfather taught me to trust the spirits when they speak." Atsá interrupted. "This dog is speaking for them. I have to listen." Her brother knelt before her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Sister, I understand your feelings, but the desert is dangerous. There are many ways to die out there, and the old cabin—" He paused, his expression troubled. "There are stories about that place. Dark stories." "What kind of stories?" Nalnish glanced back toward the village, then sighed. "Stories about a white man who lived there long ago. They say he knew things about our people that he shouldn't have known. Some of the elders whisper that he was involved in the troubles that drove us from our northern lands." Atsá absorbed this information thoughtfully. If that's true, then maybe it's time someone learned the whole story. Before her brother could respond, she turned and began walking into the desert, the injured dog keeping pace beside her with grim determination. Nalnish called after her once more, but something in her posture told him that words would not stop her now. The desert heat hit them like a physical blow once they left the protection of the valley. The sun was merciless, turning the air into something that had to be fought for with each breath. But Atsá had been born to this land, and she knew its rhythms and its demands. She rationed her water carefully, took shelter during the worst heat of mid-afternoon, and followed the dog's lead as it navigated by some internal compass toward their distant destination. The animal's condition was remarkable. It seemed to draw strength from having found its chosen guide, moving with increasing confidence as they traveled deeper into the wasteland. Occasionally, it would pause and look back at her, as if checking to ensure she was still following, and she began to understand that this was indeed a creature with a specific mission. As evening approached and the desert began its transformation, from furnace to freezer, they crested a low ridge and saw their destination below. A small, weathered cabin sitting alone in a protected hollow, smoke rising from its chimney into the purple twilight sky. The sight stopped Atsá in her tracks. The cabin was supposed to be abandoned, had been abandoned for as long as anyone in the village could remember. Yet there was clearly someone inside, someone who had lit a fire against the desert's evening chill. The dog whimpered softly and began picking its way down the slope toward the structure. Its limp, more pronounced now as exhaustion and injury, began to overcome determination. Atsá followed, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation that made her mouth dry despite the water she had been sipping throughout their journey. As they approached the cabin, she could see that it was older than she had imagined, its wooden walls silvered by decades of desert sun and wind. But it was solid, well-built, the kind of structure designed to last in harsh conditions. A faint light glowed from within, visible through cracks in the window shutters. The dog reached the door first and began scratching at it weakly, whining in a way that sounded almost like human speech. From inside came the sound of movement, slow and labored, followed by a man's voice speaking words she couldn't understand. When the door opened, Atsá found herself face to face with a white man who looked as weathered and worn as the cabin itself. He was perhaps 50 years old, his hair gone grey, and his face lined with pain and exhaustion. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, pale blue eyes that widened with shock and something that looked almost like recognition when he saw her standing in his doorway. "Dear God," he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "You look just like her." He swayed on his feet, one hand pressed to his side, where Atsá could see blood seeping through his shirt. The dog immediately went to him, pressing against his legs in a gesture of support and greeting that spoke of deep familiarity between them. "You came," the man said to the dog, his voice filled with relief and wonder. "I wasn't sure you'd make it, old friend. And you brought her. You actually brought her." His eyes moved back to Atsá, studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "What's your name, child?" "Atsá," she replied cautiously, ready to run if necessary, but held in place by curiosity and the strange certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The man's face crumpled with emotion, so raw it made her take a step backward. "Atsá," he repeated softly, "a beautiful name. Do you know what it means?" She nodded. "Eagle. Yes, your mother chose well." His voice was growing weaker, and he leaned heavily against the doorframe. "Your mother, Desba, how is she? Is she well?" The question hit Atsá like a physical blow. This dying white man in a forgotten cabin knew her mother's name, spoke it with a familiarity that suggested much more than casual acquaintance. She found herself searching his face for clues, looking for some explanation for the impossible. "How?" "Do you know my mother?" she asked, her young voice steady, despite the fear and confusion churning in her chest. The man smiled sadly and reached into his shirt, withdrawing something small and metallic that caught the last light of the setting. "Son." It was a brass button, tarnished with age, bearing the image of an eagle with spread wings. "Because, little eagle," he said softly, his voice breaking with pain and old sorrow, "I loved her once, a long time ago." As if the confession had drained the last of his strength, the man collapsed to his knees in the doorway, the cavalry button falling from his fingers to land in the desert sand at Atsá's feet. For a moment, that seemed to stretch like the desert horizon itself, Atsá stood frozen in the cabin's doorway, staring down at the collapsed man and the tarnished button lying in the sand. The dog whined softly and nudged the man's shoulder with its nose, as if trying to wake him from what looked dangerously like unconsciousness. Training and instinct overcame shock. Without fully understanding why, Atsá found herself helping the wounded stranger back into the cabin, her small arms surprisingly strong as she guided him toward a rough-hewn chair near the fireplace. The man was conscious, but barely. His breathing shallow and his skin pale beneath the weathered tan of someone who had spent years under the desert sun. The interior of the cabin revealed itself to be more complex than its simple exterior suggested. What had looked like a single room from outside was actually divided into two spaces, a main living area dominated by the stone fireplace, and a smaller section that appeared to serve as both sleeping quarters and storage. Everything was neat and purposeful, the belongings of a man who had learned to live with only what was essential, but it was what hung above the fireplace that drew Atsá's attention and made her breath catch in her throat. Mounted on wooden pegs was a cavalry saber, its blade catching the firelight and reflecting it in patterns that seemed to dance across the cabin walls. But this was no ordinary military weapon. Etched along its length were symbols she recognized from her grandfather's teachings, Apache designs that spoke of thunder and eagle spirit and the sacred directions. "You see it," the man said weakly, noticing where her gaze had settled. "I wondered if you would recognize the markings." "Those are our symbols," Atsá said softly, approaching the sword with the reverence her people reserved for sacred objects. "But how?" "Your mother carved them there," he replied, his voice gaining slight strength from memory. "It was her way of blessing the blade," she said, "of making it serve peace instead of war." Atsá's mind reeled with the implications. Her mother carving Apache sacred symbols onto a cavalry sword. It made no sense within the world she had always known, where such weapons represented threat and sorrow for her people. "I don't understand," she whispered. The man struggled to shift in his chair, his hand still pressed to the wound in his side. "No, I don't suppose you would. It was before you were born, before many things changed forever." He studied her face, again with that unsettling intensity. "But you have her eyes, child, the same way of seeing right through to the heart of things." Moving carefully around the cabin's main room, Atsá began to notice other details that spoke of a life lived between two worlds. Apache pottery sat beside military-issued tin plates. A bow made in the traditional style hung near a cavalry carbine. Most intriguing of all was a small shelf that held what appeared to be books, leather-bound volumes that suggested literacy and education, unusual for a frontier hermit. "Who are you?" she asked finally, turning back to face the wounded man. "My name is James Crawford," he replied. "Lieutenant James Crawford, formerly of the 7th Cavalry. Though I suppose that rank doesn't mean much anymore, not after—" He paused, his expression darkening with old pain. "Not after what I learned about honor and duty and the lies men tell themselves to sleep at night. The name meant nothing to Atsá, but she could hear in his voice the weight of stories untold, of choices made and prices paid. You were a soldier." "I was. I thought I was serving something noble, protecting settlers and keeping peace between peoples who seemed determined to misunderstand each other." His laugh was bitter. "I was young and idealistic and completely unprepared for the reality of what that meant." Crawford's dog had settled near the fireplace, its breathing easier now that it had accomplished its mission. The animal watched both. Humans with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand the gravity of the conversation taking place. "That's when I met her," Crawford continued, his voice softening with memory. "Your mother. It was during the treaty negotiations at Canyon D. Chelly in 58. She was there as interpreter, one of the few people who could speak both languages well enough to bridge the gap between what the officials said and what they meant." Atsá felt as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Her mother as an interpreter at treaty negotiations. It was impossible. Desbar had always been just a village woman, skilled in traditional crafts and the raising of children. She had never spoken of any involvement with military affairs or diplomatic meetings. "She was barely 20 then," Crawford said, his eyes distant with remembering. "But she had this way of cutting through all the formal language and political posturing to get to the truth of things. Both sides trusted her, which was remarkable given how much suspicion there was in the room." "What happened?" Atsá found herself asking, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "We talked," Crawford said simply. "After the formal sessions ended each day, we would walk together in the evening, and she would tell me about your people's way of seeing the world. I would tell her about where I came from, about the reasons I thought I had for wearing the uniform. Gradually, we began to understand each other in ways that went beyond words. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Atsá was only beginning to grasp. A relationship between her mother and a cavalry officer. Such a thing would have been scandalous, perhaps even dangerous, given the tensions of the time. "We fell in love," Crawford admitted quietly. "It wasn't something either of us planned or expected. It just happened, the way rain happens in the desert, suddenly and completely, changing everything it touches." Atsá struggled to reconcile this story with everything she had believed about her family's history. "But my father—" "Your father is a good man," Crawford interrupted gently. "Ashki welcomed Desbar back to the village when she returned from the negotiations, asked no questions about her time away, and raised you as his own granddaughter with all the love in his heart." "Ashki is my grandfather," Atsá said, confusion evident in her voice. Crawford's expression grew pained. "Yes, child, he is. But He stopped, seeming to wrestle with words that were difficult to speak. "I am your father." The statement fell into the quiet cabin like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief that seemed to spread outward from the words themselves. Atsá stared at this wounded white man, this stranger who claimed to be her father, and felt the world she had always known tilt on its axis. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I wish it were," Crawford replied sadly. "It would make many things simpler. But look at yourself, Atsá. Look in the mirror there on the wall." Against her better judgment, she turned toward the small mirror, mounted near the cabin's window. In its silvered surface, she saw her own familiar features, but now, knowing what to look for, she could see echoes of the man behind her in the shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, the way her hair caught. The light. "Your mother made a choice," Crawford continued quietly. "She chose her people over her heart. She chose to give you a life among your own kind, rather than trying to raise you in the world between worlds where our love existed. I've always respected that choice, even though it nearly killed me to watch her walk away." The carved sword above the fireplace seemed to gleam with new significance now, and Atsá understood that she was looking at something far more complex than a military weapon decorated with native symbols. She was looking at a testament to a love that had tried to bridge two worlds, and perhaps to the price that such love demanded. The silence that followed Crawford's revelation stretched between them like a chasm that neither seemed able to cross. Atsá remained standing before the mirror, staring at her own reflection as if seeing a stranger's face for the first time. The features she had always assumed came purely from her Apache heritage now seemed to carry echoes of the wounded man behind her. Subtle but unmistakable, once she knew to look for them. "Show me proof," she said finally, her young voice steadier than she felt. "If what you say is true, show me something that proves it." Crawford nodded slowly, as if he had expected this challenge. With obvious pain, he rose from the chair and moved toward a wooden chest that sat beneath one of the cabin's small windows. His movements were labored, each step requiring effort that drew lines of strain across his weathered face. From the chest, he withdrew a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by countless handlings. The book was thick, filled with pages that seemed to chronicle years of careful documentation. He returned to his chair and opened it to a page near the middle, turning the book so Atsá could see what was written there. The entries were in English, written in a careful hand that spoke of education and discipline. But what caught her attention immediately were the small sketches that accompanied the text, detailed drawings of Apache pottery, traditional clothing, and ceremonial objects rendered with the accuracy of someone who had spent considerable time observing and learning. "I kept a record," Crawford explained quietly, "of everything she taught me about your people's ways. I wanted to understand not just her words, but the world that had shaped her." He turned several pages, revealing more sketches and notes. "This is the pattern she used when weaving, and this," he pointed to a drawing of a distinctive beadwork design. "This is the blessing pattern her grandmother taught her for protecting children." Atsá studied the drawings with growing amazement. The details were perfect, capturing nuances that only someone with intimate knowledge of Apache craftsmanship could have recorded. But more than their accuracy, the drawings carried a quality of reverence, as if the artist had understood that he was documenting something sacred. "She shared all of this with you?" Atsá asked. "Over many months," Crawford replied. "The treaty negotiations took longer than anyone expected. There were delays, complications, meetings that had to be rescheduled. All of that gave us time to—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "To discover that we could bridge the gap between our peoples, at least in our own hearts." He turned to another section of the journal, and Atsá's breath caught. There, rendered in careful detail, was a portrait of a young woman who was unmistakably her mother, but a Desba she had never seen, laughing with joy that seemed to light up the page, even in simple pencil strokes. "She was so beautiful when she laughed," Crawford murmured, his finger tracing the edge of the drawing. "She had this way of finding humor even in the most serious discussions." The other negotiators would be arguing about land boundaries or hunting rights, and she would catch my eye and make some small gesture that would remind me not to take myself too seriously. Below the portrait, written in both English and what Atsá recognized as her mother's careful handwriting, were words that made her heart skip. For James, who sees the world through kind eyes. May you always remember that love builds bridges where fear builds walls. Desba. She wrote this the night before she left to return to her village, Crawford said softly. We both knew it was ending, that the world wouldn't let us continue what we had found together, but we wanted to record it somehow, to have proof that it had existed. Atsá turned the page and found more surprises. Pressed between the journal's leaves were small objects that clearly had significance. A braid of sweetgrass, a small piece of turquoise carved in the shape of a bear, and what appeared to be a lock of dark hair tied with a thin strip of leather. Gifts, Crawford explained, noticing her attention to these treasures. Things she gave me to remember her by. And this, he carefully lifted the lock of hair. This she cut from her own braid the morning she left. She said it was so part of her, would always be with me. The intimacy implied by such a gift was not lost on Atsá. Among her people, hair held spiritual significance, and for a woman to cut her own braid and give it to someone represented a bond deeper than casual affection. What happened after she left? Atsá asked. Crawford's expression darkened. The treaty fell apart. Not immediately. It took several months for the full betrayal to become clear, but when it did, he closed the journal carefully, his hands trembling slightly. When it did, everything we had worked for turned to ash. What kind of betrayal? The kind that gets people killed, Crawford replied grimly. The kind that makes a man question everything he thought he believed about honor and duty and serving the greater good. He looked up at her with eyes that carried the weight of old sorrows. I learned that some of my fellow officers had been conducting private negotiations with mining interests, promising them access to Apache lands that were supposed to be protected by the treaty. Atsá felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert's evening air. They were planning to steal our land. Worse than that. They were planning to provoke incidents that would give them an excuse to break the treaty and move against your people with military force. Innocent families would die so that a few white men could dig gold out of sacred ground. The scope of such treachery was almost beyond Atsá's ability to comprehend. What did you do? I tried to stop it, Crawford said simply. I tried to warn the Apache leaders, including your grandfather. But by then, trust between our peoples had been so damaged that my warnings were seen as possible tricks. And my own commanding officers. He paused, his hand moving unconsciously to the wound in his side. Let's just say they didn't appreciate my change of heart. They did this to you? Atsá asked, looking at the blood seeping through his shirt. Crawford nodded grimly. 3 days ago, I had evidence, documents that proved the conspiracy, names of the officers involved, details of the mining claims they had already filed. I was trying to get that evidence to people who could use it to expose the truth. He gestured weakly toward another part of the cabin. It's all there, in that wooden box by the window. Everything needed to prove what really happened during those treaty negotiations. Atsá moved toward the box he had indicated, finding it secured with a simple latch. Inside, she discovered a collection of papers, official documents bearing military seals, maps marked with mining claims, and correspondence between officers that detailed the conspiracy Crawford had described. But it was another item in the box that truly captured her attention. A small silver locket, tarnished with age, but still beautiful in its delicate craftsmanship. When she opened it, she found herself looking at 2 miniature portraits, one of her mother as a young woman, and one of Crawford in his cavalry uniform, both looking younger and filled with hope. She gave me that the last time we met, Crawford said, watching her examine the locket. After she learned she was carrying you, she said she wanted me to have something to remember both of you by, even though she knew we could never be a family. In the way we had dreamed, The revelation hit Atsá like a physical blow. Her mother had known she was pregnant when she left Crawford, had made the choice to return to the Apache village, knowing she carried his child. "She never told you?" Crawford asked gently, seeing the shock on her face. "She never spoke of any of this?" Atsá shook her head, her young mind struggling to process the layers of deception and sacrifice that seemed to define her very existence. "She never said anything. I always believed, we all believed, that my father died when I was too young to remember." "In a way, that's true," Crawford said sadly. "The man I was when I loved your mother did die when I learned the truth about the treaty betrayal. What's left is someone who has spent 8 years trying to find a way to make amends for the harm done in my name." The weight of these revelations settled on Atsá's shoulders like a heavy blanket. Everything she had believed about her family, her heritage, her place in the world, had been built on carefully constructed lies designed to protect her from a truth too complex and painful for a child to understand. "Why now?" she asked finally. "Why are you telling me this now?" Crawford's expression grew urgent. "Because the danger isn't over. The mining interests that corrupted those treaty negotiations are still active, still looking for ways to access the lands they believe contain gold. My former commanding officer, Colonel Morrison, has retired from the army, but he's now working directly with a mining consortium based in Tucson." He struggled to rise from his chair again, moving toward the window to peer out at the darkening desert. "They've been conducting new surveys, filing new claims. I have reason to believe they're planning another operation against your people, using the same tactics that worked before. Create an incident, blame the Apache, send in troops to restore order while the miners move in behind them." The implications were staggering. Not only was Atsá learning that her entire family history was a carefully maintained fiction, but she was also being told that her people faced renewed danger from the same forces that had threatened them years before. "How do you know all this?" she asked. "Because they tried to recruit me," Crawford replied bitterly. "Morrison approached me 6 months ago, thinking I might be willing to guide them to Apache camps in exchange for a share of the profits. When I refused," he gestured to his wound, "let's just say they made their displeasure known. And you sent your dog to find me. Rex knew your scent from items your mother left here years ago," Crawford explained, looking fondly at the animal. "By the fire. I trained him to track back to the Apache village if something ever happened to me. I never expected—" He paused, studying her face again. "I never expected he would bring back my daughter." The word hung in the air between them. Daughter. Despite all the evidence, all the explanations, part of Atsá still struggled to accept this fundamental redefinition of who she was. She had been Atsá, granddaughter of Ashki, member of the Apache people. Now she was being asked to accept that she was also the daughter of a white cavalry officer, inheritor of a legacy that bridged 2 worlds in ways that could bring either understanding or destruction. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Crawford moved carefully back to his chair, the effort clearly draining what remained of his strength. "Now, you have a choice to make, Little Eagle. You can take that evidence back to your people and help them prepare for what's coming. Or you can walk away from all of this, pretend you never found this place, and let others decide the fate of your village." "That's not really a choice at all," Atsá replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "No," Crawford agreed, with a sad smile. "I didn't think it would be. You have your mother's sense of responsibility along with her courage." He leaned back in his chair, his breathing becoming more labored. "There's one more thing you should know, daughter. Whatever happens next, whatever choices you make, I want you to know that every day since your mother walked away has been filled with thoughts of you both. I may not have been there to watch you grow up, but you've never been far from my heart." The simple honesty of the statement broke through the last of Atsá's emotional barriers, and she felt tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. Tears for the father she had never known she had, for the mother who had sacrificed her own happiness to protect her daughter, and for the complexity of a world that seemed determined to force impossible choices on those who dared to love across the boundaries others had drawn. The night in the cabin passed slowly, marked by Crawford's labored breathing and the occasional whimper from Rex as the dog dreamed near the dying fire. Atsá sat in the chair across from her father. She was still struggling to think of him in those terms, watching the play of shadows on his weathered face and trying to process everything she had learned. Sleep had been impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind filled with images from the journal, questions about her mother's choices and fears about the danger Crawford claimed was approaching her village. The weight of the silver locket around her neck, he had insisted she wear it, served as a constant reminder that her life had been built on foundations that were far more complex than she had ever imagined. As dawn light began to filter through the cabin's small windows, Crawford stirred and opened his eyes. For a moment he seemed disoriented, but then his gaze found her face and he smiled weakly. "You're still here," he said softly. "Part of me wondered if I had dreamed it all." "I'm here," Atsá confirmed, though she wasn't entirely sure what that meant anymore. Was she here as his daughter, as a representative of her people, as a child caught between worlds she barely understood? Crawford struggled to sit up straighter in his chair, wincing as the movement aggravated his wound. "There's something else you need to see," he said, his voice gaining strength with purpose. "Something I've been saving for the right moment." He directed her attention to a leather pouch hanging from a peg near his sleeping area. "Bring that here, please." The pouch was heavier than she had expected, and when she opened it under Crawford's instruction, she found herself looking at the most beautiful piece of jewelry she had ever seen. It was a silver locket, larger and more elaborate than the one she now wore, but what made it truly extraordinary was the intricate beadwork that surrounded it. Apache patterns executed in tiny beads of turquoise, coral, and white shell. "Your mother made this," Crawford explained, his voice thick with emotion. "She worked on it for months during the treaty negotiations, combining her traditional skills with silver I traded for in Tucson. She said she wanted to create something that honored both our peoples, something that could exist in either world." Atsá held the locket carefully, marveling at the precision of the beadwork and the way it complemented rather than competed with the silver base. When she opened it, she found 2 miniature photographs, more recent than the portraits in the smaller locket, showing her mother as she looked now and a space that had clearly been reserved for another image. "She brought this to me 2 years ago," Crawford continued. "It was the last time we met. She had heard rumors that mining interests were becoming active again in the territory, and she came to ask if I knew anything that might help protect the village." "She's been in contact with you all this time?" Atsá asked, struggling to reconcile this information with her image of her mother as someone who rarely left the village. "Not regularly," Crawford said quickly, "only when circumstances demanded it. Your mother is many things, but she has never been careless about the safety of her people or her family." He paused, studying Atsá's face. "She made me promise that if anything ever happened to me, I would find a way to get word to you about your heritage. She said you deserved to know the truth when you were old enough to understand its complexities. And you think I'm old enough?" "Now?" Crawford's expression grew serious. "I think circumstances have made the choice for us. The mining consortium I told you about, they're planning to move within the next few months. There have been surveyors in the area, men asking questions. In Tucson about Apache settlements and water sources. My sources tell me they're planning to stage an incident that will give them an excuse to call for military intervention." The implication sent a chill through Atsá that had nothing to do with the morning air. The same strategy they used before. Exactly. Create a conflict, blame the Apache for breaking the peace, send in troops to restore order, and in the confusion, establish mining operations on lands that are supposed to be protected. Crawford's voice carried the bitter weight of experience. "It worked before because people like me were too naive or too corrupt to stop it. It could work again if no one is prepared." Atsá turned the large locket over in her hands, feeling its weight and understanding that it represented far more than beautiful craftsmanship. It was a bridge between worlds, a testament to love that had transcended cultural boundaries, and now, perhaps, a key to preventing history from repeating its worst patterns. "What did my mother say when she gave you this?" she asked. Crawford's eyes grew distant with memory. "She said that someday, when you were ready, you would need proof of who you really are. Not just Apache, not just white, but someone who belonged to both peoples and could speak for both. She said the old ways of choosing sides weren't going to be enough anymore, that the future would require people who could build bridges instead of walls." The wisdom of her mother's words resonated through Atsá like the sound of a bell, clear and true and impossible to ignore. She had always felt slightly different from other children in the village, not just because of her unusual spiritual sensitivity, but because of something deeper, a sense that she was meant for something that went beyond the traditional roles her people assigned to young women. "She knew this day would come," Atsá said quietly. "She knew I would eventually have to choose between hiding the truth and using it." "Your mother is one of the wisest people I've ever known," Crawford replied. "She understood that secrets kept to protect can sometimes become the very things that destroy. She wanted to give you the option of truth when the time came." Atsá closed the locket carefully and hung it around her neck beside the smaller one, feeling the weight of both her heritages settling against her heart. The morning sun was now streaming fully through the cabin windows, painting everything in golden light that seemed to promise new beginnings. "I have to go back," she said, though the words came out sounding more like a question than a statement. "Yes," Crawford agreed gently. "You do, but not empty-handed, and not without understanding what you're walking into." He gestured toward the box of documents. "Take everything. The papers, the maps, the correspondence. Your grandfather will need to see it all if he's going to make informed decisions about protecting the village." "What about you?" Atsá asked, suddenly reluctant to leave this man who had become, in the space of a single night, the most important person in her world outside her family. Crawford's smile was sad but peaceful. "I'll be here when you need me, little eagle. And if the worst happens, if the consortium moves against your people despite all preparations, Rex knows how to find me. I may not be the soldier I once was, but I still have some fight left in these old bones." The promise carried more weight than simple words, and Atsá understood that her father, yes, she could think of him that way now, was offering to stand with her people regardless of the personal cost. It was a gift that went beyond jewelry, or documents or explanations of the past. It was the gift of alliance, when alliance could mean the difference between survival and destruction. The journey back across the desert tested Atsá in ways that went far beyond physical endurance. The documents Crawford had entrusted to her seemed to grow heavier with each step, not because of their actual weight, but because of the responsibility they represented. Every piece of paper in her carefully wrapped bundle could mean the difference between her people being prepared for what was coming or being caught off guard like their ancestors had been decades earlier. Rex had insisted on accompanying her despite his injuries, and she was grateful for the companionship. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of their mission, moving with determined purpose across the harsh landscape despite the obvious pain in his wounded leg. Several times during their journey, he paused to look back toward the cabin as if torn between his loyalty to Crawford and his new bond with Atsá. "He'll be all right," she told the dog during one of these moments, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince Rex or herself. "He's survived this long on his own. He can survive a little longer." But even as she spoke the words, she worried about Crawford's condition. The wound in his side had looked serious, and he had clearly been weakened by days of blood loss and infection. What would happen if he took a turn for the worse while she was gone? What would happen if she never saw her father again? The thought struck her with unexpected force. Somewhere during the night at the cabin, Crawford had transformed from a mysterious stranger into someone she genuinely cared about. The connection wasn't just based on blood, though that certainly played a role, but on recognition of shared qualities that went deeper than genetics. His sense of justice, his willingness to sacrifice for others, his ability to see beyond the artificial boundaries that divided peoples, all of these resonated with values her grandfather had spent years teaching her. As the familiar landmarks of home began to appear in the distance, Atsá felt her anxiety increasing rather than diminishing. How could she explain where she had been? More importantly, how could she explain what she had learned? The truth would shatter her family's carefully maintained fiction, but lies would leave her people vulnerable to the approaching threat. She created a small rise that overlooked her, a village, and paused to gather her thoughts. From this vantage point, she could see the normal activities of daily life: women working at their looms, children playing near the stream, men tending to horses and weapons. It looked peaceful, secure, unchanged from the world she had left behind 2 days earlier. But she now knew that this peace was an illusion, that forces beyond their control were already in motion to destroy everything they held dear. Rex whined softly beside her, sensing her internal struggle. She reached down to scratch behind his ears, finding comfort in the simple act of connection with another living being who understood the weight of difficult choices. "We have to tell them the truth," she said quietly to the dog. "All of it, no matter how much it hurts." The sound of voices calling her name drifted up from the village, and she realized she had been spotted by the sentries. Within minutes, she could see people moving toward her position, her brother Nalnish in the lead, followed by several other young men of the village. "Atsá!" Nalnish's voice carried relief and anger in equal measure. "Where have you been? Mother has been sick with worry, and grandfather has had every warrior in the territory looking for you." She stood and began walking down the hill toward her approaching family, Rex limping alongside her with faithful determination. "I followed the dog," she called back, deciding to start with the simple truth and work her way toward the more complex revelations. "It led me to something important. Important enough to risk your life and terrify your family?" Nalnish demanded as he reached her, his warrior's composure cracking to reveal the worried older brother beneath. "Important enough to possibly save all our lives," Atsá replied quietly, and something in her tone made her brother pause and study her face more carefully. "You've changed," he said after a moment. "Something has happened to you out there." "Many things have happened," she confirmed. "Things I need to share with grandfather and the council immediately. There's danger coming, Nalnish. Danger that could destroy our village if we're not prepared." Her brother's expression shifted from relief to concern as he registered the gravity in her voice. He had known Atsá all her life, and he had never heard her speak with such adult seriousness about matters of tribal importance. "What kind of danger?" he asked, falling into step beside her as they continued toward the village. "The kind that comes from men who see gold in the ground and don't care who they have to kill to dig it up," Atsá replied, and was surprised by how much she sounded like Crawford in that moment. Bitter experience, coating words that should have come from innocence. By the time they reached the village center, a crowd had gathered. Desba pushed through the other women, her face a mixture of relief, anger, and fear as she took in her daughter's appearance. Atsá looked older somehow, carried herself with a new dignity that spoke of experiences that had accelerated her journey from childhood toward something more complex. "Where have you been?" Desba demanded, reaching out to touch her daughter's face as if to convince herself that Atsá was really there and unharmed. "I've been learning the truth," Atsá replied quietly, and watched as her mother's face went pale, with what looked like recognition and dread. Before Desba could respond, Ashki approached with the measured pace of someone who understood that important moments should not be rushed. His weathered eyes took in the scene, His granddaughter returned safely, but clearly changed. The injured dog at her side, the carefully wrapped bundle she carried, and most tellingly, the look of guilty knowledge that had appeared on his daughter's face. "Granddaughter," he said formally, using the tone he reserved for tribal business rather than family conversation. "You have been away from us during a time of great worry. What do you have to report?" The question acknowledged what everyone present was beginning to understand, that Atsá's disappearance had been more than childish adventure or simple disobedience. She had been on a mission, whether she had understood it initially or not, and now she had returned with information that demanded the attention of the tribal leadership. "I have much to report, grandfather," Atsá replied, matching his formal tone. "But some of it should be shared with the full council, and some—" She looked directly at her mother. "Some should be shared with family first." Ashki nodded slowly, his experienced eyes reading the currents of tension and hidden knowledge that swirled around the group. "Then we will do both," he decided. "Council fire tonight, after the evening meal. But first," he gestured toward their family's dwelling. "First we talk as family." As they walked toward the wickiup, Atsá became aware of a weight in her bundle that she had not noticed before. Reaching carefully into the wrapping, her fingers found something Crawford had not mentioned giving her: a broken piece of clay pipe, its surface decorated with the same symbols she had seen on the cavalry sword. She pulled it out and showed it to Ashki, who stopped walking so abruptly that Rex nearly collided with his legs. "Where did you get that?" her grandfather asked, his voice tight with emotions she couldn't identify. "From the cabin," Atsá replied. "There were many things there, grandfather, many things that tell stories I think you already know." Ashki's shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time in Atsá's memory, her grandfather looked every one of his 68 years. "Yes," he said quietly, "I know the stories. I had hoped they would stay buried, but it seems the spirits have other plans." The broken piece of pipe in Atsá's hand seemed to pulse with the weight of old promises, shattered agreements, and the persistent hope that somehow, despite everything that had gone wrong in the past, there might still be a way to build something better from the pieces. The family gathering that followed was unlike anything Atsá had ever experienced. Inside their wickiup, with Rex settled protectively near the entrance, 3 generations of her family sat in a circle that felt more like a tribunal than a homecoming. The broken pieces of the peace pipe lay in the center of their circle, fragments of clay that somehow seemed to carry the weight of decades of hidden pain. Desba had not spoken since they entered the dwelling, her eyes fixed on the pipe fragments, with an expression that mixed sorrow, fear, and something that looked almost like relief. Ashki sat with the stillness of carved stone, his weathered hands folded in his lap as he waited for his granddaughter to begin whatever revelation she had brought home from the desert. "I know about James Crawford," Atsá said finally, deciding. That direct truth was the only way to navigate the complex emotions filling the small space. "I know he was at the treaty negotiations. I know he and Mother—" She paused, struggling with words that would forever change how her family understood itself. "I know he's my father." The words seemed to echo in the confined space, reverberating, with implications that reached far beyond simple parentage. Desba's intake of breath was sharp and painful, while Ashki closed his eyes as if absorbing a blow he had long expected, but still dreaded. "How much do you know?" Desba asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know about the conspiracy to break the treaty," Atsá replied, unwrapping the bundle of documents Crawford had entrusted to her. "I know about Colonel Morrison and the mining interests. I know that you and Crawford tried to prevent a massacre and were blamed for causing one instead." She spread the papers between them, maps and correspondence that painted a picture of betrayal and greed. "And I know that the same people are planning to do it again." Ashki opened his eyes and leaned forward to study the documents, his expression growing increasingly grave as he recognized names and places from his own memories. "These are authentic," he said after several minutes of careful examination. This correspondence, I remember some of these meetings, some of these promises that were made and broken. There's more, Atsá said, reaching into the bundle to withdraw what had been hidden at its very bottom. A detailed map marked with surveyor's symbols and mining claims. But this wasn't one of Crawford's documents. This map was newer, marked with recent dates and contemporary notations that made her blood run cold when she understood their significance. I found this in Crawford's jacket, she explained, though that wasn't entirely true. The map had been there, but it hadn't been his. It had been taken from the men who shot him, evidence of their current activities that made their historical crimes pale by comparison. The map showed their village and the surrounding territory, but marked with symbols that indicated planned mining operations, water access points, and what appeared to be suggested locations for military encampments. Most chilling of all were the notations in the margins, dates from the coming month, personnel assignments, and a schedule that suggested coordinated action was already in motion. They're not just planning to repeat the past, Atsá said, her young voice carrying horror at the scope of what she was seeing. They're planning to improve on it. Look here. She pointed to a section of the map that showed their village surrounded by red marks. These aren't just mining claims. These are positions for a siege. Desba finally spoke, her voice thick with tears she was struggling not to shed. How long have you known? She asked her father. How long have you known that this day would come? Ashki was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between the map and his daughter's face. Since the day you came back from the treaty negotiations carrying James Crawford's child, he said finally. I knew then that the connections between our worlds would not stay buried forever. I had hoped, he paused, his voice becoming heavy with the weight of old decisions. I had hoped that by keeping the truth hidden, I could protect you both from the consequences of choices that were made in love, but could be seen as betrayal. You knew about Crawford all along? Atsá asked, though she was beginning to understand that her grandfather's wisdom had always gone deeper than she had realized. I knew that your mother had found something precious during those negotiations, Ashki replied. I could see it in her eyes when she returned, the way she carried herself, like someone who had discovered a great truth. When you were born, he smiled slightly, the first warmth he had shown since she had revealed the broken pipe. When you were born, I looked into your face and saw features that came from beyond our people, but I also saw spirit that belonged entirely to us. Why didn't you ever tell me? Atsá asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Because there was no safe way to tell you, Desba said, finally finding her voice fully. In our world, you were my daughter and Ashki's granddaughter, accepted and loved without question. In the white world, you would have been evidence of something that many would see as shameful or dangerous. I chose to protect you from that burden for as long as possible. But the burden found me anyway, Atsá pointed out, touching the lockets at her throat. And now it's found all of us. She reached into the bundle one final time and withdrew the item that had shaken her most when she discovered it tucked inside one of Crawford's books, a detailed drawing of their village, complete with accurate notations about defensive positions, water sources, and the locations of family dwellings. But this drawing was different from the others she had seen. This one showed the village as it had existed 8 years ago when she was born, suggesting that someone had been conducting surveillance of her people for her entire lifetime. They've been watching us, she said quietly, spreading the drawing where they could all see it. All these years, while we thought we were hidden and safe, they've been studying us, learning our patterns, planning for the day when they would move against us. The implications were staggering. Their village had been compromised for years. Without their knowledge, their movements and defensive capabilities catalogued by people who intended to use that information to destroy them. Ashki studied the drawing with the eye of a warrior who had spent decades learning to assess tactical situations. This level of detail could only come from extended observation, he said grimly. Someone has been watching us for years, probably from multiple positions in the surrounding hills. Or someone has been feeding them information, Desba added, her voice carrying a note of suspicion that made them all pause to consider the possibility of betrayal from within their own community. No, Atsá said firmly, surprising herself with her certainty. Crawford told me something about how they work. They use people from outside the community, traders, travelers, anyone who might have legitimate reasons to be in the area. They gather information piece by piece over years, building a complete picture without any single source realizing what they're contributing to. The strategy was both brilliant and terrifying in its patience. Rather than risk exposure by placing spies within the Apache community, the mining consortium had simply observed from a distance and gathered intelligence from the many sources that moved through the territory in the normal course of trade and travel. How long do we have? Ashki asked, studying the dates marked on various documents. Atsá traced her finger along the timeline notations on the map. Based on these schedules, they're planning to move within the next month, maybe less. The room fell silent as the full scope of their situation became clear. They were facing an enemy that had been planning this operation for years, that knew their village better than they knew it themselves, and that had the resources and organization to execute a coordinated attack that would leave no room for the kind of desperate resistance that had saved Apache communities in the past. There's something else, Atsá said quietly, dreading to share the final piece of information that made their situation even more desperate. Crawford is wounded, possibly dying. The men who did this to him, they know he was trying to warn us. They'll be watching for any signs that their plan has been compromised. The silence that followed was the silence of people confronting their own mortality and finding it closer than they had ever imagined. But it was Ashki who finally spoke, his voice carrying the quiet strength that had made him a leader through decades of impossible choices. Then we must be very careful about how we use the time we have left, he said, and we must decide whether we fight, flee, or find another way to survive what's coming. The council fire that evening burned, brighter than any in Atsá's memory, fed by mesquite wood and the urgent need for clarity that seemed to emanate from every person gathered around it. Word of her return and the gravity of what she had discovered had spread through the village with the speed that only truly important news could achieve. Now, as the desert settled into its evening chill, representatives from every family sat in the traditional circle, their faces painted orange and gold by the dancing flames. Ashki stood at the center of the circle, holding in his weathered hands a sacred eagle feather that had been passed down through generations of tribal leaders. The feather was more than a symbol of authority. It was a covenant with the spirits that guaranteed truthful speech and wise counsel in moments when the survival of the people hung in the balance. My granddaughter has returned to us with knowledge that will test everything we believe about safety, about trust, and about the choices we make when faced with forces beyond our control. Ashki began, his voice carrying the formal cadence reserved for the most serious tribal business. What she will tell you tonight will challenge some of you, frighten others, and ask all of us to consider paths we have never walked before. He handed the eagle feather to Atsá, a gesture that acknowledged her transformation from curious child to bearer of vital intelligence. The weight of the feather in her small hands felt enormous, not just because of its physical presence, but because of what it represented, the right and responsibility to speak truth to her people regardless of how difficult that truth might be to hear. 2 days ago, I followed a wounded dog into the desert because something in my spirit told me it was important, Atsá began, her young voice steady, despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. What I found there has changed not just my understanding of who I am, but my understanding of the danger we all face. She told them everything: Crawford's identity, the conspiracy that had destroyed the treaty negotiations decades earlier, her own parentage, and most importantly, the evidence that the same forces were preparing to move against their village within a matter of weeks. As she spoke, She passed around the documents Crawford had entrusted to her, watching as recognition and alarm spread through the gathered council members like ripples in still water. The reaction was immediate and intense. Some council members expressed outrage at having been kept in the dark about Desbar's relationship with a cavalry officer. Others focused on the strategic implications of being under surveillance for so many years. But it was old Hashke, the village's most respected war leader, who cut through the emotional responses with the practical wisdom that had kept him alive through 40 years of warfare. "The past cannot be changed," he said firmly, his scarred hands gesturing toward the documents spread before the council. "What matters now is what we do with the knowledge we have been given. These papers tell us that our enemies know our weaknesses, our routines, our defensive positions. They also tell us exactly when and how they plan to attack." Yiska, one of the younger warriors, leaned forward with the eagerness of someone ready for immediate action. "Then we strike first. We know where their camps are, where their survey teams operate. We could eliminate the threat before they're ready to move against us, and prove to the entire territory that the Apache are the aggressors they claim we are," Hashke replied patiently. "Think, nephew, if we attack first, we give them the justification they need to bring the full weight of the territorial government down on our heads. Every settlement within 100 miles would be calling for military protection, and we would find ourselves facing not just a mining consortium, but the United States Army." The sobering reality of their situation settled over the council like a heavy blanket. They were facing an enemy that had spent years preparing for this confrontation, that had resources and political connections they could never match, and that had structured the entire operation to ensure that any aggressive response from the Apache would be seen as proof of the threat they claimed to be defending against. "What other choices do we have?" asked Atsá's aunt, Sitala, who rarely spoke at council meetings but whose voice carried weight when she chose to use it. "Do we abandon our ancestral lands? Do we scatter like seeds on the wind and hope some of us survive to carry on our traditions?" "We could send messengers to other Apache bands," suggested Nalnish. "Unite our peoples as we did in the old days when faced with common threats." Ashki shook his head sadly. "The other bands have their own problems, their own territories to defend. By the time we could organize any kind of unified response, the attack would already have come. Besides," he gestured toward the surveillance drawings, "how do we know the mining consortium hasn't been watching them as well? Any gathering of Apache warriors would be seen long before it could pose a real threat to their operations." The discussion continued for hours, with various council members proposing strategies that ranged from desperate to impossible. Fight or flee seemed to be the only real options, and neither offered much hope for the kind of survival that would preserve their way of life for future generations. It was well past midnight when Atsá finally stood again, the eagle feather still in her hands, and offered the perspective that had been building in her mind throughout the long debate. "There is a third choice," she said quietly, her words cutting through the increasingly desperate discussions. "We don't fight them with weapons, and we don't run from them in fear. We expose them." The council fell silent. Every face turned toward the young girl who had brought them this crisis and was now proposing to lead them out of it. "What do you mean?" Hashke asked, his warrior's instinct skeptical of any solution that didn't involve steel and strategy. Atsá moved to the center of the circle, holding up the documents that detailed the mining consortium's illegal activities. "These papers prove that Colonel Morrison and his partners have been conducting illegal operations on federal land, that they've been planning to provoke violence against peaceful Apache communities, and that they've been systematically violating every treaty protection that exists." She paused, looking around the circle at faces that reflected growing understanding. "What if we took this evidence to the territorial authorities before they have a chance to stage their incident?" "You want to trust the white man's law?" Yiska asked incredulously. "The same law that has been used to steal our lands and justify attacks on our people for generations. I want to use their own weapons against them," Atsá replied, with conviction that surprised even herself. "Colonel Morrison's plan depends on secrecy, on being able to control how events are perceived by the outside world. If we expose his conspiracy before he can implement it, we turn his own strategy against him." Desba spoke for the first time since the council had begun, her voice carrying the weight of years spent watching the consequences of hidden truths. "It's dangerous," she said slowly. "If we reveal what we know, we also reveal how we learned it. We expose James Crawford to retaliation, and we expose our own family's connection to him." "The danger is already there, Mother," Atsá replied gently. "Crawford is wounded and possibly dying. The mining consortium already knows he was trying to warn us. The only question is whether his sacrifice serves a purpose or whether his information dies with him." Ashki studied his granddaughter's face in the firelight, seeing in her expression the same combination of courage and wisdom that had drawn him to support Desba's relationship with Crawford all those years ago, despite the risks it had posed to their family's standing in the community. "You're proposing that we trust strangers with our survival," he said carefully. "Territorial officials who have never shown particular concern for Apache welfare." "I'm proposing that we trust evidence," Atsá corrected. "Crawford's documentation doesn't just prove what the consortium is planning, it proves that they've been violating federal law, territorial law, and treaty obligations. Even officials who don't care about Apache lives might care about that kind of systematic law-breaking if it's presented to them in ways they can't ignore." The idea was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its reliance on systems that had never been designed to protect people like them. But as the council members passed the documents around once more, studying them with new understanding of their potential power, a different kind of hope began to emerge. "Who would take such evidence to the authorities?" Hashke asked pragmatically. "None of us can walk into the territorial capital and expect to be taken seriously by white officials." "I know someone who can," Atsá said quietly. "Someone who has the knowledge to present the evidence effectively and the connections to ensure it reaches the right people." "Crawford," Desba said, understanding immediately. "You want to bring him here?" "I want to bring him home," Atsá corrected, and something in her tone made everyone present understand that she was talking about more than just strategic necessity. She was talking about family, about healing old wounds, and about the courage required to build bridges across chasms that had been decades in the making. The eagle feather trembled slightly in her hands as she made her final argument. "Our ancestors survived by adapting to threats that would have destroyed peoples who couldn't change. This consortium is betting that we'll respond the way we always have, with weapons or with flight. But what if we respond with something they're not prepared? Or what if we respond with their own law, their own evidence, their own system turned against them?" The silence that followed was the silence of people recognizing a moment of historical significance, understanding that the choice they made in the next few minutes would determine not just their own survival, but the survival of future generations, who would inherit either the wisdom of their decision or the consequences of their failure. Finally, Ashki stood and extended his hand toward his granddaughter. "Give me the feather, child. It's time for the council to vote." The vote that followed was unlike any in the village's memory. Rather than the usual process of discussion leading to consensus, this decision required each council member to formally declare their position on a course of action that could either save their people or deliver them into the hands of their enemies. One by one, the eagle feather passed around the circle, and one by one, the voices of the Apache leadership committed to Atsá's bold strategy. When the feather returned to Ashki's hands, the decision was unanimous. They would attempt to expose the mining conspiracy through legal channels, using Crawford's evidence and his knowledge of the territorial government to turn the white man's law against itself. "Then we are committed," Ashki announced formally. "May the spirits guide our path and protect us from the consequences of our courage." But even as the council dispersed and families returned to their dwellings to prepare for what was coming, Atsá knew that the hardest part lay ahead. Getting Crawford to the territorial capital would require moving him in his wounded condition across more than 100 miles of desert. More challenging still would be convincing him to expose himself to the very people who had already tried to kill him once. The next morning brought the discovery that would test their resolve even sooner than expected. Nalnish returned from his dawn patrol with news that made everyone's blood run cold. Fresh survey markers had been planted less than 5 miles from their village during the night, and tracks suggested that a significant group of armed men was operating in their territory. "How many?" Ashki asked grimly. "At least a dozen horses, maybe more," Nalnish reported. "They're not trying to hide their presence anymore. These markers aren't just for surveying, they're marking positions for an encampment." The implications were clear. The mining consortium had accelerated their timeline, possibly because they suspected their plans had been compromised. Instead of weeks to implement their strategy, Atsá and her people now had days at most. "We have to get Crawford now," she said urgently, the weight of leadership settling on her young shoulders with uncomfortable familiarity. "If they're moving this quickly, he may be our only chance to get the evidence to the authorities before they stage their incident." Desba's face was tight with worry that went beyond strategic concerns. "He was badly wounded when you left him. A journey to the territorial capital in his condition will kill him," Atsá finished quietly. "But staying hidden in that cabin will kill him too, just more slowly. At least this way, his death might serve a purpose." The brutal calculus of survival had forced her to think like an adult, to weigh lives against possibilities and choose the path that offered the greatest hope for her people's continuation. It was a burden no child should have to bear, but the circumstances had made her the bridge between worlds that her mother and Crawford had always hoped she might become. Within an hour, a rescue party had been organized. Hashke insisted on leading a small group of warriors to provide protection, while Desba prepared medical supplies that might help stabilize Crawford for travel. Most importantly, Atsá worked with the village's most skilled craftsmen to create something that had never existed before. A unity bracelet that combined traditional Apache beadwork with symbols representing her father's military service. "What is this for?" asked Sitala, watching her niece work the intricate pattern with surprising skill. "It's a bridge," Atsá replied, her small fingers moving with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was creating. "Something that shows we're not asking him to choose between his world and ours. We're asking him to help us create something new." The bracelet took shape under her hands, its pattern telling the story of two peoples learning to work together rather than against each other. The beadwork incorporated traditional Apache colors, turquoise for protection, white for peace, black for strength, but arranged them in patterns that also suggested cavalry insignia and federal authority. When it was finished, the bracelet seemed to pulse with symbolic power that went far beyond its simple materials. It represented hope, cooperation, and the possibility that love could indeed build bridges where fear had built only walls. "It's beautiful," Desba said softly, touching the completed work with gentle fingers. "Your father will understand what it means." "I hope so," Atsá replied, "because if he doesn't, if he can't find the strength to make this journey, then everything we've planned will fall apart." The rescue party departed at midday, moving with the swift efficiency of people who understood that time was their enemy as much as any human adversary. Rex, despite his injuries, insisted on leading the way back to Crawford's cabin, his determination matching their own urgent need to reach the man who might be their salvation. As they rode across the desert landscape that had become the stage for so much drama in her young life, Atsá found herself thinking about the strange twist of fate that had brought them to this moment. A wounded dog had led her to discover truths that could either destroy her family or save her people. Now she was racing back across that same desert, carrying gifts of love and hope to a man she had known for less than a day, but who had already changed the entire course of her life. The unity bracelet rested safely in her pouch, its weight small, but its significance enormous. In a few hours, she would discover whether her father had the strength to accept what it represented, the chance to stand with his daughter's people in their moment of greatest need. They found Crawford barely conscious, but still alive, his weathered face grey with pain and exhaustion, but his eyes brightening with surprise and hope when he saw Atsá enter the cabin. "You came back," he whispered, his voice so weak she had to lean close to hear him. "I wasn't sure." His words were interrupted by a coughing fit that brought blood to his lips, confirming everyone's fears about the severity of his condition. "We're here to take you home," Atsá said simply, kneeling beside his chair and taking his hand in hers. "My people have voted. They want to try your plan, expose the conspiracy through legal channels. But they need you to present the evidence." Crawford's eyes widened with understanding and something that looked like disbelief. "Your people voted to trust me. After everything that's happened between our worlds, they voted to trust the truth," Atsá corrected gently. "And you're the only one who can help us present it in a way that might actually work." She withdrew the unity bracelet from her pouch, holding it where Crawford could see the intricate pattern she had woven. "This is for you," she said, placing it carefully in his hands, "to remind you that you don't have to choose between being my father and serving your people. You can be both." Crawford studied the bracelet with tears in his eyes, his fingers tracing the patterns that so perfectly combined the visual languages of both cultures. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "But child, I don't know if I have the strength for what you're asking. The journey to Tucson alone will be difficult," Hashke interrupted, stepping forward with the authority of someone accustomed to making hard decisions in desperate circumstances, "but not impossible. We've prepared a travois, medical supplies, and a route that will get you there alive. And if I die along the way, then you die fighting for something that matters," the war leader replied bluntly. "Which is more than most men can say about their deaths." Crawford managed a weak smile at the warrior's directness. "You don't believe in false comfort, do you?" "False comfort gets people killed," Hashke replied. "Truth gives them a chance to make informed choices about how they want to die." While the two men spoke, Desba had been quietly examining Crawford's wound and preparing supplies to help stabilize him for travel. When she finally looked up, her expression was grave, but not hopeless. "He can make the journey," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years treating injuries in a harsh environment. "But it has to be soon, before infection sets in beyond what we can control." The decision was made quickly. They would depart immediately, traveling through the desert night when the temperature would be cooler and their movement less likely to be detected by the mining consortium's patrols. Crawford's few possessions were packed, the cabin was secured, and within an hour they were moving across the landscape that had become the unlikely stage for a drama that could determine the future of Apache-white relations in the entire territory. The journey tested everyone's endurance. Crawford's condition fluctuated between periods of semi-consciousness and moments of clarity when he could contribute to their discussions of strategy and timing. During one of these lucid moments, as they rested in the shadow of a red rock formation, he turned to Atsá with an expression of profound gratitude. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that finding you, learning that I had a daughter who could stand as a bridge between our peoples, has given meaning to everything that came before. All the pain, all the mistakes, all the years of wondering. If I had thrown my life away for nothing." "You didn't throw anything away," Atsá replied firmly. You planted seeds that are only now beginning to grow. The unity bracelet on his wrist caught the desert sunlight as he reached out to touch her face with gentle fingers. You're going to change the world, little eagle. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday you're going to show people that the barriers between us are artificial, that love and understanding are stronger than fear and prejudice. We're going to change it together, she corrected. You, me, mother, grandfather, all of us working as family. The word seemed to give him strength, and for the remainder of their journey, Crawford held on to it like a lifeline. Family, not just the biological connection between father and daughter, but the chosen bonds that could unite people across any divide if they had the courage to reach for them. By the time they reached the outskirts of Tucson, Crawford had rallied enough to sit upright and begin organizing the evidence they would present to territorial authorities. The mining consortium's conspiracy would finally face the light of day, exposed by an unlikely alliance between a wounded cavalry officer and the Apache people he had learned to love. The bracelet on his wrist gleamed like a promise as they prepared to enter the town that would either vindicate their strategy or witness their destruction. Either way, they would face it together, as family should. 6 months after that desperate journey to Tucson, Atsá stood in the place where it had all begun, beside Crawford's grave near the old cabin in the desert. But this grave was different from the one she had feared she might find when she first followed Rex across the wasteland. This was the grave of a man who had died peacefully, surrounded by family, after seeing his life's work vindicated and his people's future secured. Crawford had lived just long enough to present his evidence to the territorial authorities and watch the mining consortium's conspiracy crumble under the weight of documented proof. Colonel Morrison and 3 of his associates had been arrested for fraud, conspiracy to incite violence, and violation of federal treaty obligations. The mining claims on Apache lands had been invalidated, and new protections had been put in place to prevent similar schemes in the future. More importantly, the legal victory had established a precedent that gave Apache communities new tools for protecting their rights through the white man's court system. Other tribes throughout the territory were already following the example, using documented evidence and legal advocacy to challenge illegal encroachments on their lands. Crawford's compass sat on his grave marker, its needle pointing steadily toward true north, a direction that had come to symbolize the path of integrity he had chosen to follow despite the personal cost. Atsá touched the compass gently, remembering the last conversation she had shared with her father. "You did it," she whispered to the desert wind. "You found a way to make your life count for something good." Rex, now fully healed and as devoted to Atsá as he had once been to Crawford, sat beside the grave with the patient dignity of a dog who understood the importance of remembering. The animal had become something of a legend in the Apache village, honored as the messenger who had brought salvation to his people. The sound of approaching horses drew Atsá's attention back to the present. Desba and Ashki were riding toward the cabin, accompanied by a small group that included several territorial officials and a newspaper correspondent from Phoenix. Today marked the formal dedication of the cabin as a historical site, a place where people could come to learn about the cooperation that was possible when individuals chose courage over fear. "Are you ready for this?" Desba asked as she dismounted and approached her daughter. Over the months since Crawford's death, their relationship had deepened and strengthened, built on a foundation of shared truth rather than protective secrets. "As ready as anyone can be," Atsá replied with a smile that held both sadness and hope. "I think he would have liked knowing that his cabin would become a place where people learn about building bridges instead of walls." The dedication ceremony was simple but meaningful. Ashki spoke about the importance of choosing understanding over suspicion, while territorial officials praised the legal precedent that had emerged from Crawford's evidence. The newspaper correspondent took careful notes that would help spread the story throughout Arizona territory and beyond. But it was Atsá's speech that would be remembered longest by those who heard it. Standing beside her father's grave, wearing both lockets and the unity bracelet she had crafted for him, she spoke about the future she saw for her generation. "My father used to tell me that love builds bridges where fear builds walls," she said, her young voice carrying clearly across the desert air. "But I think he only understood part of the truth. Love doesn't just build bridges, it teaches us that the walls were never really there in the first place. They existed only in our minds, put there by people who wanted to keep us apart so they could control us better." She gestured toward the mixed group of Apache and white officials who had gathered for the ceremony. "Look around you. See what's possible when we choose to see each other as people instead of enemies. This is what my father died for. Not just to save my village, but to prove that cooperation is stronger than conflict." The ceremony concluded with the presentation of a plaque that would be mounted beside the cabin door. Its inscription, suggested by Atsá and approved unanimously by both Apache and territorial representatives, read simply, "In this place, James." Crawford and the Apache people proved that courage and truth can overcome prejudice and greed. May all who visit here remember that our shared humanity is stronger than our artificial divisions. As the officials departed and the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Atsá found herself alone with her family at the graveside. The desert silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the cabin's eaves, and the distant call of a hunting hawk. "What happens now?" she asked her grandfather, though she thought she already knew the answer. "Now you continue the work," Ashki replied with quiet pride. "You've become what your parents dreamed you could. Be someone who can speak for both peoples, who can help them understand each other instead of fighting each other." Atsá nodded, feeling the weight and the privilege of that responsibility settling comfortably on her shoulders. At 9 years old, she had already accomplished more than most people achieved in entire lifetimes. But she knew this was only the beginning. The compass on Crawford's grave caught the last light of the setting sun, its needle steady and true. Looking at it, Atsá made a silent promise to the father she had known so briefly, but loved so deeply. She would continue following that true direction, building bridges wherever she found walls, choosing understanding over suspicion, and proving every day that love was indeed stronger than fear. Rex stood and pressed against her leg, ready to follow wherever she might lead. Together, they began the walk back toward the village, toward the future they would help create, toward the world where her father's dreams of cooperation and understanding would finally become reality. Behind them, the desert wind whispered through. The cabin that had become a monument to the power of love, to transform even the most unlikely circumstances into hope.